As humans, we like to be enlightened. One of the greatest achievements of the human race is science. It is through science that we attempt to understand the natural world around us. And one of the greatest scientific controversies today is the debate over biblical creationism versus Darwinian evolution. Now, each of us has been affected by this debate in some way, and each of us has our own views regarding this. And each of those views is known as a worldview. It is essential to understanding and analyzing the creation-evolution debate. And many argue that the creation model has been replaced by the evolutionary model now that humans have a better understanding of the natural world. Some argue that evolution is a near irrefutable fact because of the surmounting evidence that they claim supports it. But creationists contest this idea, claiming that there is surmounting evidence that supports their views, and many have done scientific research that affirms their faith in the creation model. The creation-evolution debate has persisted for some time. It is not only a scientific matter, but can also be understood through history, philosophy, and literature as well. Let's take a look. Before I get in depth about the debate, I would like to clarify that when I say creation or creationism, I'm referring to the Judeo-Christian belief that God created the earth in 6 literal days, unless I specify otherwise, because if I didn't, then creation and evolution do not necessarily need to be mutually exclusive, because there are several Christians and Jews who believe in evolution. There are also several religions who have their own version of the creation story, but the biblical one seems to be the one that is most challenged by evolutionists. Also, when I refer to evolution, I'm referring to Darwinian evolution, unless I specify it otherwise, because evolution can also refer to natural selection or adaptation in species. There's a lot to say regarding the history of the creation versus evolution debate. But to give a quick summary of the debate, evolution as it is understood today began in 1859 when Charles Darwin published his book, The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Thomas Henry Huxley, a British zoologist and associate of Darwin, earned the title Darwin's Bulldog because he was a strong advocate for Darwin's theory of evolution. In 1860, Huxley debated Bishop Samuel Wilberforce at the meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, and as Samantha Hauserman describes it, Huxley's triumph over Wilberforce symbolized the 19th century conflict between religion and science. And according to Encyclopedia Britannica, in 1874, the American Protestant theologian Charles Hodge published his book, What is Darwinism?, where he challenged Darwin's theory, claiming evolution to be the most thoroughly naturalistic that can be imagined, far more atheistic than that of his predecessor Lamarck. He also compared the design of the human eye to that of a watch, claiming that their design points to designer, and that the denial of design in nature is actually the denial of God. In Dayton, Tennessee, in May of 1925, substitute teacher and high school football coach John T. Scopes was arrested for teaching evolution, which violated Tennessee's Butler Act, which prohibited teaching evolution or any theory that challenged creationism as taught in the Bible in public schools. This began the Scopes trial, also known as the Scopes Monkey trial or the Scopes Evolution trial, in July of 1925, The jury ruled that Scopes is guilty, and the court charged him $100, or they fined him $100. This fine was canceled upon appeal to the Tennessee Supreme Court, and the Butler Law was eventually repealed in 1967. And according to Basics in Human Evolution, the last state law prohibiting teaching evolution in public schools in the United States was repealed in 1968 because the courts decided that these laws were unconstitutional endorsements of a sectarian religious restriction that were forced on the general public. After this, the creationists drafted laws to allow for creationism and evolution to be taught alongside each other to provide a fair choice to the children in public schools. But they were struck down in cases such as McLean versus Arkansas Board of Education in 1982 and Edwards versus Aguillard in 1987. Now, this is some of the recent history behind the creation versus evolution debate. Now that you're all caught up, I want to explain the philosophy behind the debate. One important aspect of the creation-evolution debate, as well as practically any debate, is the unwillingness of one side to see things from the other side. And some people grew up in church believing the biblical account of the 6 days of creation. Some grew up believing that evolution and the Big Bang are scientifically proven facts. Plato described this perfectly with his allegory of the cave. In the Republic of Plato, he describes how our nature is enlightened or unenlightened by comparing our perception of the world to a cave with shadows of objects projected on the wall. The prisoners in the caves perceived to be the true objects themselves. But years later, when they were released from their prison, they saw the world for how it truly was. But since for so long they believed that the shadows were the true objects themselves, they had a hard time believing it, and they preferred the lie or the shadows instead of the true objects themselves. So I guess what one can take away from this is, why do you believe what you believe? Have you examined your beliefs thoroughly, or do you believe it because it's what you were taught in class, at home, at church, on television, or the internet? Whatever you believe, make sure you examine it, think about it, and think about why you believe it. And the preemptive bias that we have is referred to as a worldview, and as Dr. Jonathan Sarfati points out in his book, Refuting Evolution, the debate between creation and evolution is primarily a dispute between two worldviews, with mutually incompatible underlying assumptions. And as Donald Batten et al. Pointed out, that the creationists and evolutionists have the same facts, and that when it comes to historical science, it is not so much the evidence in the present that is debated, but the inferences about the past. In other words, someone's preemptive bias, or worldview, if you will, determines how he or she will interpret the facts presented, not necessarily the credibility of the facts themselves. Therefore, it's not enough to say that a theory is merely based off facts, because there can be more than one interpretation of how something came about. For example, if I found a log high up on a beach, I could assume that either the waves or strong winds carried it up, or a person carried it up. But unless someone was there to observe it, we really can't say for sure which one actually happened. We can only assume which is more likely based off other evidence. And another important aspect is including all the facts. I think this goes without saying. One could present a number of facts and make arguments for or against someone or something. But if they only include the facts that support their argument, while leaving out the ones that contradict their argument, they have not argued honestly. Someone could say that they were just stating facts, but a response to this could be that they were merely stating the facts that supported their theory or their idea, while leaving out the ones that contradict it. And according to Alina Bradford's Life Science article, What is Science? the scientific method states that a hypothesis must be testable and falsifiable, or there must be a possible negative outcome. Therefore, any outliers that can provide a negative outcome to a theory need to be addressed, and not merely swept under the rug. Another common problem with debates is the use of logical fallacies. And one of the most common logical fallacies that creationists accuse evolution of using against them is the straw man logical fallacy. According to a writer's reference, the straw man logical fallacy can be described as setting up a straw man, if you will, of oversimplified or altogether distorted arguments from the opposing view to be easily knocked down. And for example, in refuting evolution, Dr. Jonathan Sarfati accused the book Teaching Evolution of misrepresenting the actual creationist beliefs regarding speciation, claiming that they represent their beliefs as a creationist lawn rather than when comparing it to an evolutionary tree, when in reality what they believe is that that God created specific kinds, so it would be a creationist orchard which produced different species within the same kind through natural selection. Another common logical fallacy that creationists accuse evolutionists of is equivocation, which according to Logically Fallacious is the use of an ambiguous term in more than one sense, thus making an argument misleading. For example, in Evolution's Achilles' Heels, Donald Batten accused some teachers of redefining evolution in the conversation, such as by saying that since evolution means change, and there are examples of change, evolution is a fact. In other words, evolution can mean natural selection or it can mean Darwinian evolution, which has not been observed through operational science. He claims that the definitions are switched mid-sentence or mid-conversation as to make it seem as if Darwinian evolution had been proven. The creation-evolution debate can be understood, in part, through literature. If you do not question what you are being taught, you could end up like the characters in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Even though this is a fictional book, there are several implications that can be taken from it. The book describes what some would perceive as a utopian society known as the world state. Some could argue it is utopian because they have eliminated disease and people can live as they please so long as they do not question what they can like. But some would see it as a dystopian society because they are not allowed to question what they have been taught, and if they do, they're banished to places like Iceland or the Falkland Islands. Now, central to Brave New World is the practice known as hypnopaedia, where children were taught how to think by having a voice repeating things to them in their sleep. And it was thought that 62,400 repetitions make one truth. This continuous repetition concrete ideas in their mind that they would not have thought to question. As one of the characters, Mustafa Mann, stated that one believes these because one has been conditioned to believe them. Near the end of the book, spoiler alert, two characters, Helmholtz Watson and Bernard Marx, thought for themselves and questioned what they had been taught, and they were eventually deported to the Falkland Islands, where they would be among all the people who have got too self-consciously individual to fit into community life and have individual ideas of their own. Another book somewhat similar to Brave New World is George Orwell's 1984. This book describes a dystopian society where people likewise were not allowed to question what they have been taught, but only accept blindly what they've been taught by the Ministry of Truth, which is run by the government, or known as the Party, in Oceania, not to be confused with the continent that currently exists. Things were not quite as pleasant for anyone in Oceania who questioned what they had been taught. Instead of being sent to a place with other freethinkers like in Brave New World, they were captured and brought into the Ministry of Love, where they were tortured and brainwashed. In the book, the Ministry of Truth would alter past documents to fit the present, depending on the superstate with which they were at war, either Eurasia or East Asia. Since they controlled circulation of everything that was printed and televised, they controlled how people thought, and of course no independent thinkers were allowed. In the book, only two characters, Winston and Julia, questioned what they were taught by the Ministry of Truth. Brave New World in 1984 are fictional, but they relate surprisingly well to the creation-evolution debate. I reference Brave New World to emphasize the hypnotizing effect of repetition, where if one has had things like evolution is a fact, or it's true because it's in the Bible, repeated to them enough, is assumed to be true. And when people question it, they are often ostracized from their peers. Similarly, when the majority of people believe something is true, it also has a hypnotizing effect. It's especially true when the majority of experts and scientists believe something. However, 1984 portrays that even minorities of one can possess the truth, even when everyone else opposes it. This can be explained as truth versus credibility. Credibility does not determine truth, and vice versa, but it merely indicates which is more likely to be true. And in fact, according to a writer's reference, attacking the people who hold a belief rather than refuting their argument is called ad hominem, which is Latin for to the person. So if you attack someone's credibility rather than their argument, you're in violation of the ad hominem logical fallacy. And it is worth mentioning that, of course, while credibility does not determine truth, it is important for evaluating trustworthiness of information, especially information from the internet. So it's only natural to question the academic integrity of someone's arguments, but does not necessarily determine the truthfulness of their argument. Evolution is the belief held by the majority of people in the scientific community today, and has been held by scientists such as Charles Darwin, of course, Thomas Henry Huxley, Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins, Carl Sagan, and Neil deGrasse Tyson, just to name a few. Of course, there are many more. Darwinian evolution is the belief that all life came from a single-celled organism billions of years ago in a primordial soup. According to the Knowledge Book, National Geographic's The Knowledge Book, it's currently believed that the Earth is about 4.55 billion years old. The universe is about 14 billion years old. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, it is believed that organisms adapt and change to their environment through the process known as natural selection, or survival of the fittest. And over long periods of time, natural selection will produce new traits in organisms that they will need to survive in certain environments. The organisms that did not possess these traits would die off. The most famous examples of this is Darwin's finches. They believe that the survivors would procreate a new species would eventually form as a result of natural selection based off the demands of the environment. Evolutionists have also looked at the similarities between organisms and have argued that this is evidence for common ancestry. For example, they have noted the similarities in the skeletal structures of humans, birds, horses, bats, and turtles, have argued that these creatures are examples of common ancestry. According to the Knowledge Book, evolutionists believe that there have been 20 mass extinctions, or 20 periods of mass extinctions in the last 440 million years, with the most famous being the meteor that supposedly struck the Yucatan Peninsula 65.5 million years ago, causing the extinction of the dinosaurs. Other than the observation of what appears to be a meteor crater on the Yucatan Peninsula, there is also evidence such as a traceable layer of pitch that can be found all over the world, and they claim that this corresponds to the end of the Cretaceous period, when the dinosaurs were thought to have gone extinct. And according to Encyclopedia Britannica, Modern evolutionary theory is based off the order of the fossils in the fossil record, going from simple to complex from the bottom to the top. From this information, they attempt to explain the order in which they are thought to have evolved, the times when they appeared. For example, according to National Geographic's The Knowledge Book, it is thought that the earliest animals showed up during the Paleozoic era, when the continents were all still one landmass, and a mass extinction took place at the end of this period 290 million years ago. According to the video Evolution Explained in 4 Minutes, it is believed that in order for evolution to take place, it needs to be a substantial amount of time. Since the Earth is believed to be about 4.5 billion years old, there has supposedly been enough time to carry out the necessary permutations and combinations. According to calculus for scientists and engineers, early transcendentals, radiometric dating is used to calculate the objects such as fossils, bones, and meteorites, solving for the exponential decay equation and rearranging the equation into a logarithmic equation. They attempt to determine the age of the object, and the device that they use to measure the trace amounts of radiometric isotopes is known as a mass spectrometer. In my opinion, not too many people understand what creationism is or the arguments in its favor, so before I explain their arguments for their beliefs, I'd like to give a quick summary of their beliefs. First of all, as mentioned before, there are several different forms of creationism. And in his book, Basics in Human Evolution, Andrew Petter described creationism as an umbrella term which masked a range of views among religious believers about the role of extranatural and natural causes in the history and diversity of life. And he lists several forms of creationism, such as flat earthers, geocentrists, young earth creationists, gap creationists, stage creationists, progressive creationists, and theistic evolutionists. And theism is the belief in God, so even though they believe in evolution, that would imply some sort of creation. But I will not go into detail about all the different forms of creationism, but I'll mainly focus on young earth creationism and their beliefs, which are rooted in the Bible, in that God created the universe in 6 literal days, as described in Genesis 1:1-31. And they believe that God created things perfectly and created Adam and Eve with free will, and it was through the disobedience to God, described in Genesis 3:1-24, that death and suffering entered the world. And for many young earth creationists, their belief in death and suffering after the fall, as it is known, is the biblical reason, but not the only reason, that they do not believe in evolution, and which would require billions of years of death and suffering leading up to Adam and Eve. And as Dr. Don Batten et al. Explained in the Creation Answers book, according to the history in Genesis, God created everything and described it as very good. It was human sin, rebellion against the maker and sustainer of the universe, that brought death and suffering into God's good creation. And contrary to what some may think, the Bible does not teach a flat earth. And while there are some creationists who teach this, it has not been the consensus among most of them. Dr. Jonathan Sarfati explains that verses in the Bible that indicate a flat earth are misinterpreted by their original context. There are extreme creationists who believe in a flat earth. There's even an organization known as Flat Earth Doctrine, which is dedicated to teaching the belief in a flat earth, which they claim is supported by over 240 Bible verses. And just to give an example, one of the verses that they use to support this idea This is Isaiah 40:22, which states that he sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. However, in his article, Is the Eretz Earth Flat?, James Holding points out how there is no Hebrew word for sphere, or at least not at the time it was written. So when it was written in Hebrew, it could have meant circle or sphere, but likely sphere. And as for the other verses used by Flat Earth Doctrine, it is clear that they came to the conclusion that the verses supported a flat earth because of the preemptive bias they already had, or because of their worldview, and in this case they literally view the world as being flat. But I mean, let's take for example, they said that in Psalm 27 verse 11 said they used straight instead of curved to describe a path, but it would not make sense at all to read Psalm 27:11 as, "Teach me your way, O Lord, lead me in a curved path because of my oppressors." Almost every person who believes in a round earth says things like straight ahead, because saying things like curved ahead are just overly literal and awkward. And creationists also believe that the geological features that we see today were caused by flood, as described in chapters 6 through 8 of the book of Genesis. They believed that it produced rapid burial for fossils, and that it was incredibly turbid and was responsible for things like continental drift, and after the water supposedly receded, it led to the Ice Age, according to their beliefs. For thousands of years, young Earth creationism was widely accepted even by some of the most foundational scientists and mathematicians, such as Isaac Newton, Galileo Galilei, Louis Pasteur, Robert Boyle, Blaise Pascal, Leonard Euler, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, Johannes Kepler, John Dalton, James Joule, and Gregor Mendel, to name a few. And today, creationism is not regarded as a valid model for science by the majority of the scientific community. People who believe in it are often ridiculed for their beliefs. Critics of the Bible have challenged its teaching, especially regarding the idea of a 6,000-year-old universe and a global flood, and they claim that there's not enough scientific evidence to support it. But in his book, The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution, Richard Dawkins quoted Jerry Coyne saying that the biogeographic evidence for evolution is now so powerful that I have never seen a creationist book, article, or lecture that has tried to refute it. Creationists simply pretend that the evidence doesn't exist. Nearly every scientist today believes in Darwinian evolution. It is taught in all public schools. Nearly every college campus is proclaimed to be a fact, various places in the media, so why do creationists continue to cling to their beliefs in spite of all the scientific evidence that is supposedly against them? So they hold to a strictly biblical teaching and disregard any scientific evidence, such as the creationist and Flat Earth Doctrine. But for many creationist scientists, it is both for scientific and biblical reasons. Contrary to what many believe, creationists are not too busy many creationists are not too busy looking down their Bibles that they can't see any evidence that contradicts their beliefs. I mean, there are entire organizations like Creation Ministries International and Answers in Genesis that are dedicated to teaching the scientific evidence in support of young Earth creationism, the scientific flaws, and the theory of evolution. For example, in the book Evolution's Achilles' Heels, 9 PhD scientists listed aspects of the theory of evolution that challenged the credibility of the theory, and some of the aspects that they challenged were radiometric dating, the fossil record, the geological record, and genetics. Dating, Dr. Jim Mason pointed out the inconsistencies in the method and explained how it is impossible to know the initial amount, the parent element, which is essential to know its age, since no one was there to observe its initial amount, and if something were millions or billions of years old, it could be subject to contamination, and he gave the example of filling up a graduated cylinder with water. If it has a constant flow rate, then it should be easy to predict how long it takes to fill it up, based off its current amount, initial amount, Florida. It states that the calculation of the length of time, though apparently quite straightforward, makes a number of assumptions about the past, which, without an eyewitness present throughout the process, cannot be known to be true. And he pointed out how scientists have radiometrically dated rocks from the eruptions of Mount Ngauruhoe in New Zealand in 1949, 1954, and 1975, using the potassium-argon method, and found that their dates ranged from 270,000 to 3.5 million years old. The same dating method was used on rocks from Mount St. Helens. The Mount St. Helens eruption in 1984 in Washington. And it was found that the whole rock dated to be 350,000 years old. An eruption from 1984. And the pyroxene that they tested produced an age of 2.8 million years old. He went on to point out other problems with radiometric dating as well, such as the amount of helium which diffuses quickly. And if you look at helium balloons, you can see that helium diffuses quickly, but it was found in zircon crystals that were dated to be 1.5 billion years old. But if it diffuses quickly, then it shouldn't remain there after 1.5 billion years. And contrary to Dawkins and Coyne, there have been several creationist books, articles, and lectures that refute evolutionists' interpretation of the fossil record. Creationist interpretation of the fossil record is that almost every fossil that we see was buried rapidly during Noah's flood, as described in Genesis 6 through 8. Not that it proves it, but it's consistent with it. They believe that the strata, or sedimentary layers, were laid down with it in short time intervals rather than over the course of millions of years. They pointed to examples of tree trunks that protrude through several strata, which would not stick around for millions of years waiting for the sediment to build up. And they've also pointed out to soft-bodied fossils such as jellyfish, squid, and even vertebrate fossils such as ichthyosaurs giving birth that they claimed would have had to have been buried rapidly. Contrary to another of Dawkins' claims that not a single fossil contradicts evolution, there have been several fossils found that are problematic for evolution. For example, in his article Soft Dinosaur Tissue, Dinosaur Soft Tissue, Calvin Smith pointed out how soft dinosaur tissue has been found with complex proteins such as collagen, osteocalcin, and hemoglobin still intact, and they haven't broken down into simpler ones. The fossil even contained trace amounts of carbon-14, which he claimed that after 1 million years there shouldn't be a single atom of carbon-14 left, because it all would have decayed. And there have also been, he also pointed out inconsistencies in the fossil record, such as Confuciusornis, a beaked bird found in the same layers as dinosaurs, pollen in the Precambrian strata, grass and dinosaur coprolites. Coprolites are fossilized feces, and dinosaur remains in the stomach of a dog-like creature. All of these fossils are out of place in the evolutionary timeline, some by several millions of years from when they were supposed to appear. There's other evidence in the geologic record that supports Noah's flood other than fossils. For example, according to the Creation Answers book, there are several examples of bent and deformed sedimentary strata that do not show signs of cracking or heating, which would mean that it had to have been soft when formed. And since hard rocks like sandstone and limestone do not bend, but break, and also it would take a massive amount of force, such as continents submerging into or converging into each other to produce such bends. And they have also pointed to depressions in the ground, such as water riffles, animal tracks, raindrop marks, that have been observed, that have, in a sense, been fossilized and buried rapidly, according to them. And they have also pointed to the Morrison Formation, which is a sedimentary deposit that stretches from Canada to Texas. They have interpreted the evidence to claim that these were laid down in the worldwide flood described in the Bible. Creationists and evolutionists both recognize that there is similarity between animals and between other organisms. While evolutionists believe it is due to common ancestry, creationists believe it is due to common design. And instead of an evolutionary tree that describes all life coming from a single cell formed in primordial soup, they believe in a creationist orchard, describes biblical kinds, as described in Genesis, that were created, and through natural selection produced different species, according to Sarfati. And they also point out the complexity of even the simplest cells, and point out the improbability of forming even a simple cell in a primordial soup. Dr. Sarfati pointed out how even if one assumed that 20 amino acids, 387 proteins, and 10 amino acids conserved per enzyme were necessary for the formation of a simple cell, the probability would be about 1 in 10 to the 5,035, which would be about the same probability of guessing a 5,000-digit security pin on the first try. Sarfati also claimed that since there are about 10 to the 80th atoms in the universe, 10 to the 12th atomic interactions per second, they're thought by many to be 10 to the 18th seconds since the beginning of the universe. Only 10 to the 110th interactions would be possible. This is all assuming that we're formed in a simple cell, where in reality cells are much more complex. These are a few of the problems that they have with evolution, but evolution does not necessarily disprove that there is a creator, which is essential to creationism. Ken Ham claimed that the best evidence for a creator are the laws of logic, the laws of nature, the ability to reason and argue logically about the objectivity of these laws. And C.S. Lewis stated it this way: if the solar system was brought about by an accidental collision, the appearance of organic life on this planet was also an accident, and the whole evolution of man was an accident too. If so, then all our thought processes are mere accidents, the accidental byproduct of the movement of atoms. And this holds for the materialists and astronomers as well as for anyone else's. If their thoughts, i.e. materialism and astronomy, are merely accidental byproducts, why should we believe them to be true? So I see no reason for believing that one accident should be able to give a correct account for all the other accidents. One might ask why the creation-evolution debate is important. For Christians, it is very important, and C.S. Lewis explained it as Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing cannot be is moderately important. Belief in evolution does not mean disbelieve in God, but it is often used to undermine the idea that God exists. And because of this, several creationist scientists have sought to defend it through scientific evidence and logical and mathematical reasoning. This comes at the cost of ridicule from people like Richard Dawkins, who refers to them as history deniers. The creation-evolution debate has been at the center of many controversies, and as with everything, if people are not willing to see things from the other side and have open, respectful conversations about it, this will not get any better. True science is open to criticism and skepticism. If we truly want science to progress, then we need to challenge each other's beliefs, including our own, and thoroughly examine every piece of evidence. Creation-evolution debate certainly caused people to examine the evidence thoroughly. As a result, people have gotten a better understanding of the issue. Historically, and as Plato described, people have almost never been open to new or different ideas that challenge the ones that have been held for so long. And creationists and evolutionists both have been guilty of this. even when people were so sure that what they believed was true, they had been wrong. Eventually, some of those old ideas, such as spontaneous generation, were replaced by new ideas such as abiogenesis. And now some people are just as dogmatic about abiogenesis as the people who believed in spontaneous generation were about spontaneous generation. Ridicule and censorship will never produce fruit in true science, so I long for the day when people can only put down their metaphorical weapons and work together, realizing that different views, no matter how popular or unpopular, are necessary for a society of free thinkers. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to, I have only scratched the surface about this issue, so if you're curious about this, I certainly encourage you to do your own independent research, because I personally find this topic quite fascinating. I hope you do.